Imagine waking up to breaking news. Russian forces have landed on American soil. Jets roar, sirens wail, headlines flash in red. Invasion. For a moment, reality tilts. Cold War nightmares, paratroopers, submarines, bombers feel less like fiction and more like headlines. But could this ever really happen? To answer, we must cut through decades of myth. The truth begins with history and geography. Russia once held parts of Alaska, not through armies, but through trade and survival in the frozen north. Today, the Bering Strait, just 55 miles wide, separates two superpowers. Close enough to see each other's shores, yet divided by ice, distance, and danger. If we want to know whether Russian boots could ever tread American ground, we must start here, with the forgotten past and this unforgiving frontier. This is Episode 1, Neighbors at the Edge of the World. This is Russia's invasion of America, fact or fiction. Let's begin with a revelation that still surprises people. Russia once held territory in North America, not as a rumor, not as a fleeting raid, but as a legal imperial possession. They called it Russian America. The road to Russian America did not begin with a single dramatic conquest. It began with patience and hardship, or maybe the Russian word is better, stoikost, endurance. Picture the 18th century. Russia's frontier was not a line, but a blur that kept moving. Hunters, trappers, missionaries, and explorers spilled eastward across Siberia, learning the cruel grammar of the taiga and tundra. They followed rivers until the rivers thinned into ice. They built boats that kissed the Pacific, and once they reached that ice-cold edge of Asia, there was only one question left. What lay beyond? In 1741, a Danish-born navigator in Russian service, Vitus Bering, sailed east. On a map, his voyage looks clean and purposeful. On the ocean, it was chaos, wind, fog, sickness, and a coastline that revealed itself like a mirage. Yet from this effort came contact with Alaska, with its archipelagos and vast, jagged shore. The explorers saw sea otters, soft-furred, almost mythic in value. Creatures whose pelts could buy fortunes in China and Europe. They found opportunity. The opportunity became a rush. Russian merchants and adventurers, Promyshleniki, launched a fur boom that would define the colony. It was a business venture wrapped in a flag. In the decades after Bering, makeshift posts and then proper settlements dotted Alaska's coast. Novo-Arkhangelsk, known today as Sitka, became the beating heart of the colony. Above it stood the governor, most famously Alexander Baranov, a figure half administrator and half adventurer. But the fur economy came with a price, paid most heavily by indigenous peoples. The Alut and Alutiiq, the Tlingit and others found their world rearranged by distant markets and imperial appetites. They were compelled into dangerous hunts far from shore, pressed to deliver quotas in waters where storms rise without warning. Some resisted. There were conflicts and uprisings, the most dramatic being the Battle of Sitka in 1804 between the Tlingit and Russian-backed forces, a reminder that this was not an empty land waiting to be claimed. It was a homeland defended. Russian America was fragile, even at its height. Supplies had to travel from Russia's Pacific ports across a hostile ocean. Ships were scarce. Winters were long. Food was sometimes shorter than hope, and competition grew. The British, through the Hudson's Bay Company, tested claims along the coast and rivers. The Americans, new to the Pacific but quick studies, brought their own ships and traders. In this chessboard of the North Pacific, Russia's pieces were powerful, but few. One of the most striking outposts was not even in Alaska. Fort Ross in what is now California, established in 1812. Imagine it, Russian settlers building on a cliff above the Pacific, far south of Sitka, cultivating crops and raising livestock to feed the northern colony. Fort Ross was a solution to a problem. Alaska could not feed itself, but solutions have lifespans. By the 1840s, Fort Ross was sold off, a sign that Russia's reach exceeded its grasp. Geopolitics pressed in. In the 1850s, the Crimean War exposed the Russian Empire's vulnerabilities. If the British and their allies could threaten Russia's Pacific possessions, how could a threadbare Alaskan colony be defended in any future conflict? The Empire's strategic calculus shifted. Alaska was valuable, but as a liability as much as an asset. And so came the deal that changed the map. 1867. The United States, led by Secretary of State William H. Seward, purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. Critics called it Seward's Folly, a white elephant of snow and silence. But history loves irony. The very land mocked as useless would yield staggering wealth, gold rushes pulsing through headlines, oil discovered beneath tundra, and later, a strategic Cold War rampart pointing at the Soviet Arctic. The transfer, marked by a ceremony in Sitka, did not erase the Russian story. It left behind place names, churches, family lines, and a surprising archive of memory in Alaskan communities. It also left behind a paradox. Russia withdrew from direct American soil, yet geography still tethered the two powers in a way no treaty could sever. Because the real hinge of this question, the hinge of invasion, of threat and possibility, is not the bill of sale from 1867. It is the narrow, icy door between continents, the Bering Strait. Stand at the edge of Alaska and look west. On a clear day, something uncanny happens. The horizon does not simply meet the sky, it shows you Russia. Between the two, the Bering Strait stretches like a scar at the top of the world. At its narrowest, roughly 55 miles of cold sea. In the middle sit the Diomede Islands, Big Diomede on the Russian side, Little Diomede on the American side, so close to each other that you can trace their shorelines with your finger from the other island. The international date line runs between them, so neighbors are separated not just by water, but by time. Two islands, two flags, two realities that watch one another across gray waves and drifting ice. Maps can deceive. On paper, 55 miles looks conquerable, a ferry ride compared to the oceans armies have crossed. But maps hide what matters. The Arctic. This is not a Mediterranean crossing swaddled in mild weather, or a temperate sea lane where ships move with clockwork predictability. The Bering Strait is a gate constantly rattled by wind. Sea ice forms, breaks, and forms again in jagged flows. Fog can swallow an entire coastline in minutes. Temperatures crash, equipment fails, fuel gels. Human endurance becomes the most precious supply, and it is always in short stock. Now imagine you're not just trying to sail a research vessel or a trawler across those waters. You are trying to transport a military. Men, vehicles, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, communications gear, generators, bridging equipment, spare parts, tents, heaters, winter kits, and 1,000 items no plan survives without. You need an armada, not a line of boats. You need icebreakers, amphibious ships, and escorts. You need air cover. You need weather you can't buy. Even if you assembled such a force on the Russian side, likely in Chukotka, using ports like Anadyr or smaller facilities to the east, you'd still face the slow-moving disaster called logistics. Each ship takes time to load, time to cross, time to unload. Each movement announces itself to satellites, radar nets, and acoustic sensors that watch the Arctic like hawks. The element of surprise, the one thing invaders crave, melts away under the gaze of 21st century surveillance. But let's pretend, for the sake of the thought experiment that built this episode, that a crossing is attempted. What then? On the Alaskan side, the first thing you hit is not the American heartland. You hit wilderness, coastlines with few roads, villages where community is stitched together by airplanes and snow machines, tundra that swallows tires and tracks alike. Even if a force sets foot there, it faces a second, more terrifying ocean, the interior of Alaska itself, vast, frozen for much of the year, and unforgiving. Supply lines would stretch like wire over an anvil. One hit, and they snap. Forward units would outrun fuel and maintenance. Air support would be contested by distance, weather, and defenses. Meanwhile, American and Allied aircraft could fly shorter routes from the south and east, hitting staging areas and ships. Submarines would prowl. Satellites would feed targeting data to long-range missiles. Every mile gained would be paid with blood and barrels of diesel. And the defenders would not be silhouettes on a map. Alaska is home to major U.S. installations and radar networks that watch the north. Early warning systems, descendants of the Cold War's DEW line, scan the sky. Air bases positioned to guard the polar approaches stand ready with fighters trained for Arctic conditions. A swarm of sensors and patrols stretches along the Aleutians. The U.S. does not need to meet an invader army to army on the beach. It can grind it down before it ever sees the beach. But perhaps, you say, an invasion does not need to be a D-Day tableau. Perhaps it looks like airborne forces, paratroopers and air assaults leaping over the strait and landing on key points to open a gate from the inside. Another map. Another deception. To deliver a serious airborne force, you need air superiority, tankers for refueling, transports that must survive the world's most watched airspace. The distances from Russian airfields to Alaskan targets are large, the weather fickle, and the radar coverage dense. Even if a small force landed, keeping it alive would demand a sustained air bridge. Again, a logistics problem wearing a bullseye. Maybe the invasion comes by submarine, by stealth, by sabotage. Maybe special operators appear where no one expects them, turning off lights, opening gates, sowing confusion. Sabotage is possible. Indeed, sabotage is what special operators train for. But sabotage is not invasion. It can create terror, even paralysis, yet it cannot conjure fuel or roads or a shield against fighters and bombers. It frays nerves. It does not capture continents. The Bering Strait does not only resist war, it shapes people. On the American island of Little Diomede, a small community lives on rock and wind, looking at Big Diomede just across the water. A daily reminder that your neighbor can be a geopolitical rival. On the Russian side, coastal Chukotka communities know the Arctic not as a point on a planning map, but as a living presence, something navigated with skill and respect. These human geographies matter. In a war fantasy, the land is empty. In reality, it is full of lives, of histories, of eyes. Let's step back and examine the seduction at the root of the invasion idea. It is the distance. That number, 55 miles, repeated like a dare. It whispers, "It's so close." But proximity is not destiny. It is only the first line of a problem set whose later lines crush the early optimism. If you doubt that, consider the Diomedes themselves. Two islands barely 2.5 miles apart. And yet for decades, a frontier that even fishermen and families could not legally cross at will. War does not make borders easier to cross. It makes them lethal. And even if, in some dire alternate reality, a crossing force found a window of good weather and surprise, there is a final, shadowed equation nobody can ignore: nuclear deterrence. In great power war, the ladder of escalation is not theoretical. It is a staircase both sides know by memory. A conventional invasion of American soil is a move that drags every step of that staircase into view. Statesmen on both sides understand this. They have always understood this. That understanding is one reason the Strait's waters have stayed what they are: cold, watched, and uncrossed by armies. So yes, Russia and America are close enough to see each other. But the Strait is a moat carved by climate, distance, logistics, surveillance, and strategy. It looks like a bridge. It behaves like a wall. Geography is not a backdrop. It is the script's co-author. Let's read a few of its lines more closely. First line, infrastructure. On the Chukotka side, ports are limited, and the window for large-scale sea lift is dictated by ice and weather. On the Alaskan side, the immediate coastline offers very few places to unload heavy equipment quickly, and even fewer where that equipment can be moved inland at speed. An invader does not merely need to land, it needs to flow. The Arctic strangles flow. Second line, detection. The modern Arctic is under a canopy of surveillance: satellites, over-the-horizon radars, patrol aircraft, undersea sensors. During the Cold War, the US and Canada built radar lines across the north, watchtowers against Soviet bombers. Those systems evolved, but the principle did not. The polar approaches are watched first, last, and always. Any massing of ships, transports, or large formations is a flare in the night. Surprise scales poorly in the Arctic. Third line, tempo. War favors speed, getting there first, striking first, moving before the enemy can react. The Arctic favors slowness. Weather slows you, ice slows you, logistics slows you. The result is brutal. An aggressor who needs speed is locked into a theater that denies speed. The defender, meanwhile, is not asked to win in an hour. They are asked to buy time. Arctic terrain sells time wholesale. Fourth line, sustainment. Imagine you succeed in placing a brigade, even a division, on Alaska's far western coast. You now have to feed it, fuel it, warm it, heal it. You must rotate parts and people. Your maintenance crews become as important as your front line. Every gallon of fuel and crate of ammunition must cross the same hazardous route you won on day one. Every ship becomes a target, every convoy an offering to weather. Sustainment is the quiet word that kills loud plans. Fifth line, political gravity. A hostile entry onto American soil triggers not just military responses, but alliances, mobilization, and the stark logic of deterrence. The idea that a limited incursion can remain limited against a superpower is fantasy. In this political gravity well, escalation is always pulling downward. Anyone contemplating invasion has to contemplate not just landing craft, but the end of the world. Most leaders choose not to roll those dice. Return for a moment to the old colony. Why does any of this matter besides trivia? Because Russian America teaches a paradox about distance and willpower. The empire that reached Alaska did so with ships, faith, and furs, not with divisions and tanks. It advanced where business made sense, and it retreated when the ledger turned red. It was empire measured in profit and endurance, not in the continuous push of conquest. That lesson echoes today. The Arctic rewards patience, partnership, and presence, not sudden invasion. When Russia sold Alaska, it was acknowledging not weakness alone, but a kind of strategic clarity. Distant outposts without deep support are peril, not power. The US later learned a parallel lesson in reverse. By investing in Alaska, its infrastructure, its communities, its defense, it turned a supposed folly into a strategic sentinel. And there's a human echo as well. The footprint of Russian America left wooden churches whose crosses still catch the sun, left surnames that twist across languages, left songs and stories where worlds met. This was never an empty frontier. It was and is a thick weave of indigenous nations: the Yupik, Inupiat, Aleut, Tlingit, Haida, and others whose knowledge of sea and ice remains unmatched. Any military plan that ignores them is not just immoral, it is operationally blind. People see, people remember, people act. Russian America faded as a flag, but endures as a lesson. The Arctic does not yield to arrogance. Why do invasion scenarios persist? Partly because stories are easier than systems. A picture of paratroopers falling through gray skies is easy to imagine and terrifying to behold. A diagram of fuel consumption in sub-zero temperatures is harder to narrate. But wars are decided by the diagrams. Another reason is that the number, 55 miles, appeals to the gambler in the human brain. We anchor on it. We think of swims and ferries and somehow ignore that these are Arctic miles. Every mile here carries the weight of 3 somewhere else. Finally, the Cold War left a kind of cultural radiation in our media. For decades, the US and the Soviet Union pointed arsenals at each other across the pole. We learned to imagine apocalypse. That imagination doesn't vanish when the flags change. It lingers. Invaders and defenders become archetypes. The strait becomes a stage in our minds. But the real stage has trapdoors, black ice, and a ceiling of steel. That's why fantasy stumbles when it tries to perform on it. History and geography shape the stage, but they don't win wars. The frozen waters of the Bering Strait may keep armies apart, yet in the 21st century, invasion isn't always measured in miles or borders. To truly answer whether Russia could ever threaten America, we must move from maps to might, from the icy straits of Alaska to the steel of armies, fleets, and nuclear arsenals, and beyond that, into a battlefield that doesn't exist on any globe, the war for truth itself. Because Russia's weapons are not only ships and missiles, they are also stories, lies, and disinformation, launched not across oceans, but across screens. In our next chapter, we ask, could Russia's armies ever break America's defenses? And if not with tanks and planes, could they invade with propaganda instead? This is the war of the present. This is Episode 2, Armies of Steel, Armies of Lies.